Good morning, teachers and friends. There is learning happening in everything we see around us. Today we have amidst us three speakers from Pari, our course partners for service learning. I am Vihan of Grade 10, and on behalf of my fellow students, I take the opportunity to welcome Ms. Preeti David, Ms. Vishaka George, and Ms. Sanvati. Let's welcome them with a round of applause. Before I hand over the mic to them, let's get to know them and their achievements. Ms. Preeti David is a journalist and educational editor at the People's Archive of Rural India, better known as Pari. Her work sheds light on various aspects of life in rural India. Ms. Preeti has graduated with economics honors from Lady Shri Ram College, Delhi University. She started off her career in the field of journalism, where she worked with various TV channels, including Economic Times and BBC World. In 2017, Ms. Preeti moved to Pari and now is the head of the educational team at Pari. She works with schools and colleges to raise awareness of sensitization on rural and marginalized lives in the classroom and curriculum. Ms. Preeti is also the author of a book called Coming Home. This novel was listed under the Tata Trust Honours List in 2020. We also have Ms. Vishaka George today. She is a journalist and social media editor of the People's Archive of Rural India. She commissions, curates, and executes Pari's social media and outreach efforts. She writes on agrarian distress and labor exploitation. As a guest faculty and part of the Pari educational team, she teaches in schools and colleges across India about media ethics and rural journalism. Before joining Pari, Ms. Vishaka worked at Reuters as a business correspondent and CNN IBN as a desk editor. She is a graduate of St. Stephen College in New Delhi, and she also has a diploma in broadcast reporting from the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. Ms. Vishaka George is also an author, her book titled House of Uncommons. Her book has been nominated for the Earther Awards. We also welcome Ms. Sanvati from Pari. Thank you for joining us today. We are looking forward to learning from you, and now over to you.
Okay. Is this better with the mic? You prefer the mic? Okay, fine. All right. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you, Meera, for organizing all this and getting us here. I want to just check very quickly, do a quick dipstick check. And how many of you have been watching the news, know something about cheetahs coming to India? Yeah? You do know? Okay. So I'm going to start with a little story. A story which begins 23 years ago. Well, actually, it begins even more than 23 years ago. It begins in the 1990s. The population of Asiatic lions had been falling in our country because there was just not enough of protected space for them. So it ended up that by the 1990s, the only Asiatic lion that could be found on this planet was in a small sanctuary in Gir, in Gujarat, right? And at that point, there were about 300 lions, and it was a bit worrying, because if you have a single population of an animal, which doesn't exist anywhere else on this planet, only in one place, there is always the danger of a forest fire, of a canine virus, of maybe hunting and so on, which could decimate the entire population. That's what happened with cheetahs. Cheetahs also became extinct 70 years ago. Anyway, so this population of lions, wildlife biologists, conservationists were very worried about it, because they said, if this single population goes, we will never have any lions on our planet. And imagine all our history books, Ashok Chakra, our tales, Jataka tales, everything, they all have lions in them, right? So it was very important to keep the lions going and to have an additional population of lions in another sanctuary, which was far, but not too far, and which was also in a part of India where lions had existed before. So Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh, on the border of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, was located, and it was discussed that this would be the place where lions from Gir, an additional population, would come and live in Kuno and grow, so that now we have two distinct populations of lions, the same species, Panthera leo, right? So this was discussed by conservationists in the 1990s, and it was decided at the end of the century, 1999, that the lions must be shifted immediately without any further delay, because lions were spilling out of Gir. They were entering people's homes, they were entering villages, they were carrying away cattle, they were carrying away little children because they just didn't have enough place to grow. Now in 1999, in Kuno, there were 24 villages which existed within the national park. So the people of Kuno National Park, the Adivasi Saharia tribals and other Dalits were told, look, you'll have to move out because we want to bring lions here. This is an important national conservation effort. You know, you'll be doing something for the country. So can you please move out? We'll give you land outside the sanctuary. We'll give you land which you can, farm. And we'll build you houses. We'll give you electricity, roads, and so on. So the people who lived inside Kuno, the 24 villages, they said, initially, of course, who likes to leave their home? People have lived, they had lived there for like over 200-300 years. They'd lived with the animals. So they said, you know, do we really have to leave? We can continue to live here. And the government said, no, you really have to leave because this has to be a protected sanctuary. So this is an idea of conservation, which is debatable as to whether people and conservation can go hand in hand or not. Or do we have a conservation model which says no people, only animals, right? So this is something which you can maybe take back to your classes later and talk about. So in 1999-2000, these 24 villages, which had about 16,000 people in them, were moved out. And they were moved out quite quickly because the plan had to get into motion, right? So they didn't plow their land that year. They packed all their belongings and they left Kuno National Park to settle outside, 20-30 kilometers outside. Now, cut to 2022, and not a single lion has come. So we have this national park which was cleared for lions. People were uprooted from their homes. They were displaced. They were given lots of promises, and not a single lion came. Part of the promises also was that they would get jobs as tourist guides. They have many problems. Chief among their problems is that many of the government's promises were never fulfilled. They didn't get electricity, they didn't get water, their houses were half finished, they lived for 2-3 years in under tarpaulin sheets. The land that was given to them in exchange for this very, very fertile land within the national park, which had the river Kuno running through it, was now full of rocks, stones. It took a lot of hard work for them to get it back to, get it to yield some kind of crop, right? So there are many stories now coming out about the cheetahs which are going to land in, which have landed in Kuno. The government has spent hundreds of crores of rupees transporting African cheetahs onto Asiatic soil. Because remember that the cheetahs that went extinct in the 1950s were Asiatic cheetahs. There are no more Asiatic cheetahs left. There were a few left in Iran, but we can't get them from there. So the government has decided to bring in African cheetahs. Now, I don't need to tell you, cheetah is susceptible to, it doesn't have the immunity that that a species living here would have. They also might in turn bring their viruses, which our species have no immunity to. So this is a decision village, Bagcha, which is now being, moved for cheetahs. This was the last village left inside Kuno, which had not been moved. And these people are also going to be moved out of their homes and sent 40 kilometers away because the cheetahs have to come in here. Now the question here is, there are many questions. One is, why were the lions not sent? The lions were not sent because the Gujarat government simply refused to part with the lions. There's a Supreme Court judgment in 2013 which said, why have the lions not been sent? The Supreme Court asked, and still the lions have not come. That was 2013, we are in 2022. So the government has decided not to listen to the Supreme Court. The highest court in our land has been ignored, right? People who were displaced have been ignored. Cheetahs are being brought in at terrific costs. Hundreds of crores have been spent on them. They are being brought in. They are non-native species. They are probably, all conservationists say that the chances of them actually surviving and thriving is very, very small, right? A lot of construction has been done. These are the people who have been who are being displaced from the villages. A lot of construction has been done inside Kuno National Park with cameras and walls and barbed wire fencing and so on to make sure that the cheetahs survive. Now the question that we have for you here is, what about the people? Where are the stories about the people who are being displaced and the people whose promises, to whom the government promised certain things that were not kept? In which kind of justice Is it okay to spend so much money and effort on animals which ultimately people like you and me who can afford safari rides and who can afford to travel to Kuno and go in safari jeeps will, yes, get a chance to see. So yes, people like you and me will benefit. But what about the people who lived there too? To bring out the voices and the stories from parts of India that we otherwise don't get to hear from. So we're hearing all the voices of wildlife biologists, conservationists, people like you and me who are very happy, oh, we'll get to see cheetahs in our own land and so on. Because you and I have access to newspapers, we have access to media. We speak in a language which the media loves because everyone understands English, right? Not everyone, sorry, but people who are watching understand. But the voices of the Saharia Adivasis, the Dalit the people of Paira, the OBCs and the Kushwahas of Paira, nobody is listening to their voices. They say we go again and again. For 23 years we've been asking for water, for land, for electricity, for schools, for hospitals for our people. You promised all this to us. You told us we would have paved roads in our village. We would have electric poles. None of this has been given. And that is why, but of course money has already been spent painting the gates at the national park and saying that this is where ask Vishaka to add some more.
Democracy. Have you all learned about that? Okay. No. 4 institutions that basically account for the sound functioning of a democracy. Okay, I don't think you guys have. You have? Judiciary, legislative, executive, and the media. Okay? So all of these 4 institutions have to work well together in order to see that society is fair, equitable, there's justice, all of this. Now, let me just paint a picture of the Indian media for you. You're still young, you'll probably read some of the news, you may watch some of the news when your parents are, watching TV or whatever it is.
Okay, just before Vishaka proceeds with that, where is all these ideas of justice and equity and all enshrined in our democracy? Constitution, quite right, and directive principles, yes?
Right. So let's paint a picture of the Indian media for you. In 2015, about 7 years ago, a study was done by the Center for Media Studies. It's a research organization in New Delhi. And the question posed by a few journalists was, please tell us what the coverage of news is to urban India versus what comes out of rural India. Now your mainstream papers, right, your national dailies, like the Indian Express, the Times of India, the Hindu, etc., they were all studied, they were all surveyed, and it was found that 67% of your news comes out of New Delhi. New Delhi probably has 1/10 of this country's population, whereas 1% of your news comes out from the rest of the country, or more specifically from rural India. How many people do you think live in rural India? How many people live in India? 1.something billion.
3 billion, 4 billion, yeah, okay.
According to the census, 833 million people live in rural India. Now, when your media coverage is so skewed, when you're just covering events out of the parliament, out of Dalal Street in Bombay, out of what's happening with Brahmastra in Bollywood, you're kind of perpetuating a narrative that only some people in this country are important, and we only need to know about them. It's not your fault, it's not my fault, it's just how systems and structures work. But you're also saying that 833 million people, what they do, it's not necessary to make up the news. This is where Pari comes in and says, no, we want to challenge this idea. If you want to know why farmers are struggling in India, if you want to know why the climate crisis is so bad, if you want to know why the handloom section is probably failing, then we have stories for you. We're not in the business of news. We're not going to talk to you about breaking events. We're going to tell you about what leads up to these breaking events. Do you remember the farmers' protests a few years ago? Hundreds and thousands of farmers took to the streets. Why did they take to the streets? Do we know that? Very, very sort of superficially, right? But if you go through Pari, you'll see stories of these people telling you their problems every day. It could be a debt crisis, it could be the lack of water, it could be the lack of opportunities to sell your produce. And these are not two-dimensional people who just farm and, who go to sleep. People, like all of us, have emotions, are multifaceted, have hopes, have dreams, have children who they want to educate. So how do we talk about people in the informal sector in rural India, just like how we talk about people who we otherwise deem with respect, right? This is what we're trying to do through the art of storytelling. We're trying to bring stories about rural India, the beauty, the plurality, the diversity, the inequality into classrooms, so that when you are thinking about society, when you choose a degree later on, you have some perspective with this choice. I know your teachers were talking about how you have a course called Global Politics. I think you all are in class 9 and 10, right? Next year, you'll get into class 11. You have the option of choosing something called Global Politics. Sounds great, very fancy. You could get into jobs about policy, work in the government. But there is no understanding global politics if you don't understand the politics of your neighborhood, the politics of your village, right? If you don't have a sense of how these structures work, you're going to miss the bigger point. And with that, let's get into our next story.
Okay, so one of the biggest buzzwords right now is climate change and global warming, yes? I mean, that's, you all have grown up in your, I mean, I'm sure in the last many years, this is something that, you know, you keep hearing the word again and again. But what does climate change really mean for people whose lives depend upon the climate being a certain way? Now, you and I can sit here in Chennai, there's an AC on, doesn't matter what the damn temperature is outside, we are cool and we are comfortable. And we're able to watch this, right? But there are hundreds of millions of Indians for whom, if the climate changes, if the rain falls at the wrong time, if there is too much rain and the water all runs off, it doesn't soak into the earth, right? If it doesn't rain in a particular period, not even a drop falls from the sky, then what happens to their livelihood? What happens to people who rely on fishing, let's say, or on seaweed harvesting? What happens to them when the seas are becoming warmer and the amount of seaweed they can harvest is shrinking? What happens to fishermen when the rivers are drying up or getting heavily polluted? Then what happens to their livelihood, right? What happens to honey hunters? Yeah? What happens to people who rely on honey hunting for a livelihood? There are communities in the Nilgiris, like the Alu Kurumbas, and the Mullu Kurumbas and the Betta Kurumbas, for whom honey hunting many times a year is very much a part of their annual income. They depend on that. That little bit of money they will get will work for the next medical emergency they have. So what happens to people like this when the climate is changing and there are less bees to harvest honey from, the days have become hotter in some parts, maybe insect populations have changed, the kind of pests that farmers are dealing with has changed simply because the weather has changed, right? So climate change impacts people more than it, people who depend on it for their livelihood, depend on livelihoods around climate change, their lives are very deeply impacted by changing climate. And actually, to be honest, you and I don't get impacted that much. When we put the tap on, water flows. When we put the switch on, the AC comes on, or the fan comes on, or the light comes on, right? We are not really impacted by it. When the air is too polluted or the water is too polluted, we just reach for the next expensive alternative. But there are many people in India for whom that alternative is not available, right? But where does, so that's, again, I'm also talking in a very general sense. Let's take you to the grassroots to understand how climate change, has seeped into the smallest corners of India. So here is Odisha. This is the Niyamgiri Hills in Odisha. It was once known as the rice bowl of civilization. Over 3,000 varieties of rice were grown in Odisha. Today that number is down to, I think, 200. Yeah? Okay, put that aside for a moment. These are the Adivasis who live in Niyamgiri. They have been farming here and growing crops for centuries. And there are people selling cotton seeds, BT cotton, genetically modified cotton seeds, and saying, look, why don't you plant these seeds and you'll get a massive crop and you'll earn a lot of money. Now, many of these Adivasis cannot read the fine print on that packet of seeds. It's in English. They don't speak English. They don't read English. So they miss seeing the fact that those seeds are actually banned in India. They are being sold illegally. That the pesticide that needs to be used for it is also banned in India, right? They just understand the name of the pesticide as something which kills the grass. But they don't understand is that pesticide will also kill any other living thing in its vicinity. It will also impact and harm the people who are actually putting their hand in there and spraying. And he doesn't have a mask. All of you are wearing masks. I was wearing a mask till 10 minutes ago. There's no such concept over there. If a little bit of that liquid falls, they're going to get rashes, they will get breathing issues, nerve issues, and so on, because that's a very dangerous herbicide, right? Now, you can see at the back how they have put this herbicide just to kill all the remaining plants so that they can plant the cotton. Now, as in all agriculture, even with BT cotton, even with genetically modified seeds, agriculture is still a gamble. So it's possible that they will spend up to 10,000 rupees buying these expensive seeds in the hope that they will get 30 to 40,000. But it's also possible that if the rain doesn't fall on time or if something happens, their entire crop could go to waste, right? So that is the gamble that exists in agriculture, which has become worse because of climate change, right?
Yeah. In this story, there's an image, I think it's in the other cotton story by Chitrangada, where Obi-Wan, he's a farmer, he's operating the fertilizer in a simple loincloth. On the bottle of this fertilizer, it very clearly says, substances used are carcinogenic, which means they're cancerous. You have to basically wear a hazmat suit if you're going to use this fertilizer. He's in a loincloth because, as Preeti said, he cannot read. He's using fertilizers on the plant, which will penetrate into the soil, run into the water, and eventually reach people's taps, right? You also have these gases that are going into the air. So not only is agriculture made worse by climate change, agriculture can make climate change worse too. Now, I want to know what your understanding of this phenomenon is. Can we get a few answers? What does climate change mean to you?
Like greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and they hurt the ozone layer of the world, and that's how global warming happens. Like, that's a part of how global warming happens, and that's a part of climate change. It's just that the world is melting, kind of. Yes.
Anyone here? Okay, so we've got glaciers are melting.
The climate changing in a rate that's not supposed to.
Right. Is that normal?
Yeah.
Conditions are abnormal. Fair. Shaka, one here. Yeah.
The climate and the ecosystem changing in an inhumane rate, or like.
Right. Rapidly.
Yeah.
And in a sort of strange way. I'm going to present a scenario to you, which is a consequence of climate change. Okay? It's just a different location. Imagine now if through that door, a Gore buffalo walks in. A Gore buffalo, when on its fours, is 7 feet tall. It's the largest bovine in the world. We look at the American bison and we think, okay, huge, but the Gore buffalo found in Maharashtra and in the Nilgiris is bigger. It's terrifying. The guy's the size of a mini elephant. Farms in Ratnagiri Wildlife Sanctuary, which is close to Kolhapur, Maharashtra, are being attacked by Gore bison. Can you imagine? A farmer is just operating on his fields and he turns around and he sees this mammoth-sized creature there. This is the consequence of climate change. Why? Because forests now are being taken over by mining projects. There's not enough water. There isn't enough fruit. There isn't enough trees that support their livelihood. Animals, when they move from place to place, aren't like humans. There is no power conquest. I'm not trying to conquest land and have, all of this might. I'm literally moving in search of food. You can't blame the buffalo for moving from one place to the next because the buffalo just wants to survive. But what does that mean for the people? The people who are least guilty in the problem of climate change, the farmers, right? So people like us, the people who, I'm not pointing fingers here, but I'm saying when we live a certain lifestyle, we have ACs, we have a fleet of cars, we use various gadgets, we're possibly making the problem of climate change worse. People on the front lines of this crisis, farmers, fisherfolk, pastoral nomads, they're not aggravating the problem as badly. But as life has it, they're the ones getting worst affected by it. Because you and I don't have to deal with a cheetah, a lion, or a Gore buffalo entering our home. However, people on the front lines of this crisis do. So climate change is not just about, a tsunami. It's not just about a river overflowing. Usually these big events, a forest fire, signifies climate change. Climate change actually happens every day in very insidious ways, in ways that we may not notice, but like y'all said, it is causing a rapid and kind of unpredictable change in weather patterns, in the way we consume water, natural resources, in how animals are dying. Its effects are ubiquitous. They're all over the place. Yeah?
If you try and trace now your work backwards and you see, for example, where is our water and electricity coming from, right? It's coming from somewhere, it's being mined, right? Either there's hydroelectricity or there's coal, thermal electricity and so on. Where are those mining places? What does life look like if you live near a mine? You know, we have stories reported by children as young as 12 whose homes are near mining places in Jharkhand and Odisha. And they say that, you know, we can't grow green vegetables anymore because everything is covered with a fine red dust, right? So what we want to do for you today is we want to try and connect the dots for you. We want you to start thinking, yes, you understand climate change in this global perspective, and you know, we're all encouraged to think globally and to see the planet as a whole. But let's also walk a little bit backwards and see that how does this impact the people on the ground living those lives near the mining, the agriculturists, the pastoralists, and all, as Vishaka pointed out.
And also, if you're going to have a problem where, say, the buffalo is entering territory of farms, human life is expanding, right? The population is ever growing. What happens to the animals that are encroaching human territory? What do you think is going to happen to them? They die. They will be killed, right? Because you need to protect human life. So this imbalance in nature and the variety of species is all made worse by simple choices, by taking an extra car, by, you know, perhaps running electricity. We don't think about it like that. It seems hyperbolic to talk about the consequences of climate change when I leave a fan running for too long. But the fact of the matter is it's all interconnected. Okay, should we move on? Okay, so one of the, which one are we showing now? Do you all have any questions? Let's pause, take a little bit of a breath. You do.
Anyone here?
Is it like even legal to get cheetahs from another continent into?
Actually, you're absolutely right. The Wildlife Conservation Act says that. It's been quoted as saying that you are not allowed to import any species. It puts the species here in danger. Sorry, you.
Yeah, so...
So see, the government has ignored the Supreme Court of India saying that lions should be moved in 2013.
So shouldn't like the government be in
Exactly.
prison?
So the questions we should be asking is that why is the government allowed to flout all these rules?
Like, okay, if we're going like through journalism, why aren't they getting justice then?
Okay, let's throw that question out to the class. Why don't you think villagers or marginalized people aren't getting justice?
Because a lot of people, like, they can't communicate their needs and wants, like, in a way that a lot of people can understand. Because you said that, like, most people, they think, like, only if you speak English, you're, like, educated. But these people, like, they don't really know how to communicate with their needs. And I think that's why.
So there's maybe a problem of
There's a communication
which we
gap.
actually don't encounter too often. When we go to rural India, we may have a language barrier. Like, I may not be able to speak the local language in Kolhapur. Somebody else will be able to translate it for me. I think the bigger question here is, or maybe an answer is, are people interested in listening? Are your media corporations interested in going into the forests and speaking to the Adivasis of Bagcha? They want to talk about the cheetahs. One of the cheetahs is named Asha. I mean, yeah, sure, we hope that these animals will survive, but chances of it happening are very, very slim. So power structures dictate who can ask for justice, who will be heard, and who will get justice.
Yeah, I also think that there's just there's so many problems that people just don't want to fix them. Like, especially the government, like, because there's so many, like, small villages that haven't gotten justice, and it's just a lot of work to try to fix every single one.
Yeah, so that's the job of the media, is that, So the job of the media is not to say, oh, it's really easy for me to report in Chennai because, you know, I can just take an Uber and, you know, reach where I have to report, and I speak Tamil. I don't speak Tamil, but let's say I do, and I'll be able to understand what people are saying, and I'll print this report. Now to reach Kuno, you have to take the Shatabdi, then you have to take a car or a bus, and then you have to find a place in Kuno to stay, and there is no place in Kuno to stay. So, I mean, there is only one small guest house there. So even getting journalists on the ground in that area interested in doing that story, as Vishaka said, the reason is because which news editor, which media house is going to want that story? They're going to say, my readers are not interested in this, yeah, some villager, you know, asking for help somewhere. But one second, I just want to end this by saying that Having seen the problems at the Kuno National Park, the people who were ousted in 1999 went through, the last village, Bagcha, which is now being emptied out for the cheetahs, have held their ground. Because there is a rule. The Forest Rights Act of 2006 says that unless the village Gram Sabha signs on it and says that yes, we all are ready to go, the village actually does not need to shift. So the village is saying we are not going to sign this. They're saying until you promise us A, B, C, D and you actually show us, and the government is saying, oh, but you are only 200 people. They're saying, no, we are 300 people. You have to give all 300 compensation. So there's a little, they're holding their ground. Somebody was saying, is it easy, for them to hold their ground? Is any kind of, is it always sad stories? No. People are fighting for justice all the time. And I think these are the stories that we need to hear.
Yeah, I have a question similar to what you just said a few moments ago. If the government disobeys what the Supreme Court said, why aren't there any consequences to that? Why aren't they?
So that comes, a lot of that responsibility lies with the media. That if we don't print those stories, if we don't say the government is not obeying, then how do people like you get to know? 2 journalists, 3 journalists knowing about it is not enough. There needs to be enough people making a noise about this. Yeah?
Anyone needs the mic?
I think another reason why why they haven't been listened to is because they don't have much representation in the government. Like maybe their region has like one MLA or something who is in contact, but maybe to get to the MLA's office you have to like travel 100 kilometers or 50 kilometers, and they don't even know that the MLA exists or where the MLA is, so they don't know how to ask the government for help.
So this thing about representation, right? Very valid point. Perhaps they don't have adequate representation in local government, in state government, in national government. But representation doesn't end only in government. You should have representation in media as well. It shouldn't actually be people like Preeti and me going into Kuno and reporting on the lives of people from Bagcha. Bagcha should have journalists who say, hey, listen, this is what's going wrong. Or some remote village in the Nilgiris, they should have journalists. Because it's only people from the community who are most invested in their stories, right? So you can't have media organizations only run by a certain kind of person. Because then the news is also going to be stilted. So that's another thing Pari is trying to do. It doesn't need to be professional English-speaking journalists who report on important issues. People from across the country need to be doing this as well. So representation needs to be across societal structures. But it's a valid point.
Yeah, you mentioned about like one person, like that one village holding their ground and saying that until like we actually see you give us like the houses and everything, only then we'll move. So like the other like villages that were like evacuated for the lions, they didn't get anything and the lions were not brought there. So why didn't the government, like, why isn't there a rule that like we have to first show you, like build everything for you and then only move you?
Since I'm deeply invested in the lion and cheetah story, I'll take that question. That's a very good point. And the Supreme Court judgment came 10 years after the lions were supposed to be moved. A public interest litigation was filed by just ordinary people saying, hey, what happened, government? You were supposed to move the lions and you didn't move it, right? And that got ignored. So I just want to say one thing, which Vishaka had mentioned about representation, that, interestingly, when the people were emptied out of Kuno, they had their own Gram Panchayat inside the Kuno National Park. When they were moved out, they were attached to various other villages. And they lost their representation. If you lose your representation because you've been amalgamated into, like supposing, let's say the KC High students of 9 and 10, KC High shuts down and they move all you guys to different schools. You will lose your voice as KC High 9 and 10 students, correct? You'll be absorbed into other schools and you'll become a part of that other school. You may be a small, maybe 5 among 40 other people. So your voice and your demands will not be heard because you become a minority wherever you are. But I'm happy to say that in the last 6 months, and last 2 months, after these stories have started coming out, the Kuno people have been returned their own Gram Panchayat. So now they have a democratic legal voice in which they can, as you asked very rightly, they can demand from the government now that you promised us this and you haven't given it to us. Before this, it was difficult for them because they were scattered. Yeah?
Yeah, so I'm like it's about the lion and cheetah thing, but why is it kind of random that the government just decided to bring in cheetahs from Africa, and like why? Because if it's for like I guess tourism, but won't the same task be accomplished by just bringing in lions?
Yeah, so you know what the government has been saying is that, you know, India's grasslands need the cheetah because our grasslands are dying. And so when the cheetah comes in, other animals will come in and, you know, it'll become, the grasslands will revive again. But the truth is, and I spoke to wildlife biologists, and they say that there are enough endangered species in India which need our help to preserve them, including the lions. The government is not doing anything about that, but they are getting cheetahs from outside.
This has actually been something that's been a plan in the works for a while. Basically, we want to have as many big cats as possible. Now, the cheetah existed at one point of time in India, endangered, then extinct. Now we want to bring the species back and hopefully kind of, you know.
Conservation project. It has nothing to do with conservation bringing in a foreign animal. But yes, India gets to say, hey, we're the only country which has all 6 big mammals, the kings of the jungle exist on our soil.
Yeah. And the present government can say, we were the ones who brought the cheetahs in.
We brought back India's pride. There's no pride. Okay. All right. So we'll move on from here. Yeah.
Okay. Have you all heard of the term Adivasi? What does it mean? Yes, India's tribal population, the original inhabitants of the country, forest dwellers. Now, because of the fact that the British ruled this country, a lot of the connotations associated with the tribal population is uneducated, illiterate, barbaric, crude. These are the rough ideas the mainstream has about so-called tribal India, right? Very, very low rates of literacy. Now, this is a story from the forested hills of Idukki. Where is Idukki? Kerala. Idukki has one of the lowest literacy rates in a state that boasts of 100% literacy. Okay? The journalists were given a lead about a man who runs a tea stall in the forest that he shares with elephants, big cats, and other wild animals. So a group of 7 journalists trekked the jungle for about 25 kilometers, where they came to meet P.V. Chinnathambi. P.V. Chinnathambi is an Adivasi. He's an agricultural laborer, not a farmer, an agricultural laborer. Do we know the difference between the two? Okay, for the uninitiated.
They don't know the difference. You want to guess, anyone?
Agricultural laborer and a
Anyone
farmer.
doing economics here wants to guess, or non-economics?
Or maybe a farmer owns his land and an agricultural laborer just works in someone else's land.
Right.
He's 72, he's an agricultural laborer, which means that even at that age in his life, he's got to go looking for work on other people's farms. Now, he runs a tea stall in the forest, and there was a sack lying next to him, next to his little stove where he was boiling tea. So one of the journalists said, "What's in the sack?" He laid out a carpet and he assembled a bunch of books. P.V. Chinnathambi runs perhaps what is the loneliest library in this country, if not the world. And this population in and around Idukki is largely tribal, it's largely Adivasi, and they're the ones who borrow these books the most. This isn't just, casual literature, it's classic works that have been translated into Tamil and Malayalam, that's being borrowed frequently, read, and returned. It's actually a very successful library. It's probably doing better than the big libraries we have in the city because people are interested.
Yeah, and where is it located? You have to walk many, many, many kilometers to get here. There's no road. It's a forest track.
Yeah. And one of the books in this pile of books was a notebook. So the journalist picked it up and he said, "Chinnathambi, what is this?" And he said, "Oh, that's an autobiography I'm working on. I hope to complete it one day and I hope people read it." So another thing Pari tries to do is break stereotypes. We want to challenge these ideas that people have, which is that tribal India is illiterate, it's backward, it's barbaric. No, there is a lot of knowledge. There is a lot of curiosity even in parts of this country that we wouldn't otherwise deem so, right? So if you hear somebody's tribal or whatever, don't immediately jump to the easiest conclusion. Don't be a cognitive miser. Hopefully stories like this will help you learn how diverse and plural society is, right?
Yeah. Okay, so coming to what the People's Archive of India does, We are a people's archive. The word people is important because it means that we don't believe that only as we've been saying all this while, we believe that people should be reporting their own stories. We don't believe that you have to be a trained journalist to write a story for Pari or document something happening around you. We believe that anyone, including we have 12-year-olds who have written for us, right? So Pari is a people's archive. Why are we called an archive? Because we believe that our stories and documentation should be able to stand the test of time. Now, news changes from day to day, but our stories try and look at the issues behind the news. So if we're talking about Kuno and the cheetahs coming in, yes, the cheetahs coming in is 100% news. But what are the processes behind that cheetah coming in? Can we unpack those processes for you, for us, for the general public? Can we talk about inequalities in access to justice, in access to water, electricity, healthcare, and so on? So this is what we try and do at Pari, is we try and get you to understand what are the processes behind something happening. So the next time you guys are reading some news, I'd like you to stop a little bit and just ask yourself the question that if this is a news about, let's say, water flooding homes in Chennai, don't just stop at the news and then take it in and say, oh my God, water is flooding in Chennai, sensational, wow, this is really news. Let's try and think and ask ourselves, what are the reasons why flooding has happened? And yes, of course, you'll find out, people will be talking about maybe people are building over stormwater drains or there's been encroachment on the riverbank. Yes, that's the first level that you can go. But you can go much beyond that now that you've had some exposure to what we've done with you in the last hour. You can actually ask the question, who are the people most impacted by the flooding in Chennai? Right? Yes, it's a fantastic story for urban planning. It's a great story for water, hydrology experts and so on. But what about the people who lived on the banks, whose lives and livelihoods were in that home on the bank? And now it has been swept away in some filthy black water. None of their things will be usable again. They'll have to start from scratch. So we want you to start connecting the dots, to start taking a few steps back. Every time you see a piece of news or you hear something, don't just go with the general idea of, okay, this is it, and I move on with my life and look at my phone and look and see which movie is doing how Ronaldinho is doing or whatever. Sorry, Ronaldo. Okay, so here we have a story by a student.
Which is where Rahul Dravid lives. And you had all of these cars, these Lamborghinis and these Ferraris that were just submerged. And the news... Yeah, it's tragic. It's tragic for the people who own that. And of course it should make the news because, urban planning is on its head in that city for a large part. But before these fancy complexes were underwater, slums were devastated, right? Now that's the norm. You just expect that these things would happen. So coverage is very little. Coverage isn't done in the same way that it's done for people in urban, big, beautiful spaces.
Other mic. Sorry, where's the other mic? Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Yes.
Maybe it's because they like flashy stories about really famous and rich people.
So we get the news we deserve. Okay, this is not my line. This is some famous journalist line. We get the news we deserve. So if you and I, as consumers of news, are going to only be scrolling through or clicking on or asking for news which is sensational and which, as Vishaka pointed out, fits a certain stereotype, it's urban, it's rich, it's so on, then that's the news we'll get, right? So that's why we want you to start asking those questions when you see the news.
So a common trope that I've understood about mainstream media in at least India is I feel they're more money derivative than people derivative. Yeah.
This is not just in India,
Not
it's
just in
in
India.
democracies across the world. If you look at who owns these media houses, Bezos owns a huge part of the media in the United States. Rupert Murdoch does in the UK. In India, it's Ambani. Recently, Adani, one of the richest men in the world, bought NDTV, or a large part of NDTV. If you and I don't pay for news stories, then corporates will pay for it, and corporates will decide what these news stories are. So it depends on who is paying for the newspaper. If it's you, chances are your story will be more honest. If it's not you, you will constantly get stories of Bollywood.
Yeah, if Adani is doing mining in Niyamgiri, which Vedanta was, and it was a big story, and it was tragic because they were polluting the ground for miles, the air for miles, the water for miles around for tribals living in Niyamgiri, it did not get enough news coverage simply because the owners of Vedanta are friends with people who own media. And these stories get killed. Right? Even today there are stories which get killed. So how you choose, where you choose to read, where you give your, you give your attention is where you will get your stories.
So essentially, it's not my line, but it's from an author that I heard of. I can't remember the name. But essentially, one death is a tragedy. A group of deaths is a statistic.
Quite right. So that's exactly true. Would you like to add something? Yeah.
It's not to add anything to that. It's just that you said we have to ask for the news that we want to get, which is but like, who do we ask and how do we ask, and like, what should we do to get this news?
Okay, so Vishaka will answer that better than me. But just to say that I think the first process is to ask the questions, to ask the right questions. Like we explained to you about processes, right? So if you hear about floods, are you asking the right questions? If you ask the right questions, then you'll go searching for that news. So if you know that there are floods in Chennai, then you will look for, maybe Google the news as, like slums, banks of Chennai, what happened to them? Let's just say, I'm being a little facetious here, excuse me. But maybe Vishaka, you'd like to.
No, I mean, it's a very good question and it doesn't have a single answer. But there are ways in which you can solve the problem or lend to solving the problem. One, identify outlets that are doing good journalism, and encourage people to support journalists of that kind. Because ironically, rural journalism is very expensive. We may be reporting on the poorest of the poor, but to go to these places is actually very, very expensive, right? So who helps people who are trying to do these stories? It can only be the readers. Social media has democratized news to a certain extent, at least amongst the public, because if there is, let's say there are riots in Chennai, in a part of Chennai that people are not interested in covering, if you are in that part, you can upload a video and say, why isn't the news doing anything about this? Maybe then journalists will go there and cover these stories, right? So I don't have a one answer to a very complex question.
Yeah, so like you said, a lot of these like places to go to, it's really expensive. So like if you're just like someone like us, like a student, how can you help with?
Yeah, we're coming to that, yeah. Just read, definitely, but also join, us in okay, so here is a story. Can we see the image, Sanviti? Right. So this is Sumitra, and she's the mother of 4 children. She's also a farmer. She's also an agricultural laborer. She works in the fields of other people, right? She also runs her home and has brought up her 4 children. Now her life is actually a really tough life. She lives in Haryana. She is sometimes standing in 1.5 feet of water in July, planting paddy, replanting paddy for hours on end. She's bent over in this position. She says the water is so hot, I feel like it's boiling, beneath me, right? There are days in which she comes back, her clothes are covered in mud because, she's been in the fields for 11 hours in the day, right? She has to get up all odd hours of the night to fill water because water comes only from one tap. They belong to a Dalit family. They have access only to one tap in that village, right? The upper caste, the dominant caste, make sure that they get the lion's share of the water. So there are multiple issues that challenge her, but she's not asking for your sympathy or pity. In this story, she's just telling you about her life. And that's another point that we want to raise with you and leave you to think about, is that these stories are not stories which are to evoke your pity or your sympathy or you saying, oh, that's really sad and all. We want to show you the tremendous knowledge and resilience that people in rural India have. That despite their hardships, that despite lacking many of the things that we are used to, they still get on with their lives and they're doing fabulous things, like Chinnathambi in the Forest of Iduki, right? He's not looking for some Pulitzer about being a great, librarian or anything of that sort, right? So in the same way, Sumitra there, that's a picture of her in her field. And, there are only women. Because very sadly in this village in Haryana, all the young boys, many of them are into drugs. And they have all become drug addicts, they are not working. In fact, there is a lady in that group who has boys who are married and they are in their 30s, and they all depend on only her earnings to eat every day. Nobody else is working, right? So it's a hard life, but there are some great stories over there. For example, this story about Sumitra Bai is written by her son, who's just finished his undergraduate degree in economics in Azim Premji University. And he was interning with us at Pari 1 year ago in the summer, and on a Google Meet, because that time we weren't out here talking, he said, ma'am, what story should I do? And we said, okay, look at what's happening around you. And he said, oh, there's this trader, there's this. Then I said, Raman, why don't you do a story on a landless agricultural laborer? You're right in the heart of, agricultural Haryana. So he said, he thought about it, he said, yeah, actually there is, that's true, my mother's an agricultural laborer. She leaves every morning and comes back in the evening. So he wrote this story about her. And because he lives in that house, he was able to describe it in such fabulous detail that how in the morning before the birds are even out, you'll hear the clanging of vessels because women like his mother are filling up water. And how she barely has time to, drinks her tea in a gulp and leaves because the tractor is waiting to take her to the fields, right? How she was so keen that her 4 children are all graduates and postgraduates. And the 2 of them are working already. And how keen and how sure she was that whatever happens, I will educate my children. And the learning that Raman took from this story was, and he's done he sent us a beautiful video. He said, I learned all these textbook concepts of what it means to be an agricultural laborer, what it means to not have control over whether you'll get a job that day or not, because, as a laborer, you can get called, you may not get called, right? So to not have agency over your life and your life's decisions, to not know whether you'll be able to eat dinner and feed your family the next day. He says, I learned all this in my economics textbooks in Azim Premji University. But he says, I didn't even realize it is happening all around me. And so with these tools of observation, with these tools of connecting the dots, with these tools of examining the processes behind, he was able to write a story about his mother, which is the story that you see here. And that's him and his mom.
He's a first generation learner, which means nobody else in his family has been to school and college. Raman goes to Azim Premji University in Bangalore, has an economics degree and writes like a dream. There are lines in this story that are so poetic. He says, my mother, when she's working under the hot sun in Haryana, when she's transplanting paddy, she says she feels like she's immersed in boiling water. When she returns home from a hard day's labor, she's covered in wet mud. Right? These are vivid descriptions that only somebody very close to the picture can actually tell you about.
He says, in winter in Haryana, the temperature drops to 2 degrees out in the fields in the morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning when his mom is out. He says, my mom says that her eyelashes are covered with ice, water crystals. The water has frozen on her eyelashes. So it's a very evocative story. It's done by somebody right there. It's done by a young student, maybe a few years older than you. First generation, as we said. It's a great story.
This is also a good example of representation. Right? He's writing about his own mother. He has first-hand experience in the community. And it's a story that deserves to be heard. You asked a question about what students can do. And I think it may have come across as me brushing you off by saying read. But I want to stress on that point a little more. The power of knowing is actually tremendous. How many of you here are aspiring engineers? Too soon? No engineers? Okay. Maybe it'll be something.
Some of you aspiring doctors, lawyers, teachers, right?
To my knowledge, an engineer is not just somebody who codes, but an engineer really helps in making design better. And good design solves a lot of problems. So what is a session like this going to lend to, say, a potential engineer or an aspiring engineer? When a few years ago, Aadhaar was a very contentious issue, we reported on stories about Aadhaar and how some people aren't able to get access to, say, rations and things like that because their Aadhaar doesn't work. One of the people interviewed was a woman from Uttarakhand or Uttar Pradesh, I'm not too sure, who had leprosy. What is leprosy? Leprosy is a very traumatic virus and disease where your fingers and your toes of your limbs essentially get eaten away by bacteria, right? Now, in order to get an Aadhaar, you have to submit biometrics. One of the biometrics happens to be your fingerprints. If you authenticate yourself with your fingerprints, you will be notified as a citizen of India, you will get your rations. What do people with leprosy do? They don't have fingers. What do old people do whose fingerprints are changing rapidly? What do construction laborers do when their fingerprints are constantly changing because they're literally interacting with some of the harshest material? These are problems not thought about, and it's a shame because you're living in a country where so many people are engaged in construction, so many people are laborers, right? And if you don't authenticate yourself, you don't get access to rations. Poor people cannot walk into a supermarket and buy produce that's going to cost many thousands of rupees. You and I have that luxury, but they don't.
Because
now,
they don't earn 1,000 rupees. They earn daily wages, right? 200, 250.
Right. So as an engineer or an aspiring engineer, how can you come up with things that are foolproof, that make design better, right? So we're sitting here and we're talking to you about rural stories, but if you pay attention to these stories, there's a way of applying what you learn to solve problems in society.
Yeah, so this is the Pari education. So you all know what Pari is. We are a not-for-profit NGO. This is our education thing, which Raman's story, for example, would come here. Can you come down, Sanviti? No, sorry, go up, yeah. So the thing is that we believe, just like we've had this session with you today, we believe that there is a lot of learning that we can have from the everyday lives of everyday people. All these stories that you see have been done by students which are going on the carousel, and there are many, many more, right? We're going to show you, this story, for example, is done by 12-year-olds, right? And when those 12-year-olds went to visit this market and they did this story on this particular market, it's called a Heart, it's a weekly market in Odisha, they came back with many interesting observations and they were able to connect the dots. The observation was very simple. The observation was that largely elderly people were selling things at the market. And the reason is, can you guess why? Anyone? Yes. Tell us. Sorry?
A little louder?
No.
No. This is Orissa.
Odisha, that was in Haryana. Yes. Their children have abandoned them. Okay. Anyone else? Yes?
Because they can't work on the fields.
Right, you are.
They can't work on the
All
fields.
of you are right. So, elderly people find it difficult to do agricultural labor, so they can't work on the fields. It's too exacting for them. Somebody in their 70s or, they just don't have the strength for it. Many of them do not want, their children do not want to have them in their homes because they're an added expense, right? So, what they do is, they have tremendous dignity. So this man says, for example, I just earn enough for the week for my wife and me. We can live independently. What does he do? He puts some masala podis together and he puts them out over there on plates. So if I want to make, for example, some kind of a curry, I just pick up that, 15 rupees of masala and I'm home and dry for the rest of the week. I can make as many curries as I want to, right? So the reason he does this is, and he says, is because I don't want to rely on anybody to take care of me. So here is a person who really doesn't have two coins to rub together, but he is not does not want to be dependent, and he wants to be independent, and he's managing to do that, right? So this is a story. So I just want to point this story out to you for you to understand that what was the observation and what was the learning. And what can be our takeaway? As Vishaka is pointing out to you again and again, we are the privileged ones who will go on to study further and, be in policy, decision-making, journalism, teaching, engineering, whatever. What can possibly be our takeaway in this? What policy do you think can improve the life of that person who's selling masalas at the, which Heart, I don't know, not Jurudi, whichever Heart that was, yeah.
There's another great story on a Heart, which is basically a local market that is operational once a week.
Let's just ask them this question. I want to see if they come up with something. So, what policy can change for elderly people in our country? Yes? Quite right. Thank you. So, None of these people were getting their pension because, as Vishaka said, there was some problem with their Aadhaar or whatever. Right? Now, the pension the government gives for elderly people is not much, but at least it's some kind of a fallback option. It's, I think, 1,000 rupees in some states, 2,000 in some per month, and so on, right? What is 500 rupees a week? But it at least is some kind of a security buffer for them. Yeah.
So you get everything in these huts, okay? You will see ducks, you'll see roosters, you'll see spices, brooms, there's a tailor sitting there looking to mend your torn shirt, everything. In journalism, we have what we call the golden quote. So journalists, when they're writing a story, they're waiting for the interviewee to say one thing that'll really bring the story together, or could be potentially used as a headline. Mind you, the people who wrote these stories are between 10 to 12. So they interviewed one of the ladies who was just meandering, down the heart, and very nonchalantly she said, yeah, I love this place. You can get everything except for your mother and father, right? So that's a golden quote, and that became the headline of this story. And it really says everything that you need to know about a local heart in rural Odisha.
And who are these students? They are first generation, first time learners going to school. Their parents are agricultural laborers. They have been coming to the hut with their parents, helping them carry things back every week. They went to this hut with their teacher. They do not speak English. They wrote the story in Odia and sent it to us. And we asked them a few more questions and got a few more details. And lo and behold, here it is for perpetuity. Every little bit. Who is this broom seller? What are the problems he has? He says, that I find it very difficult to get grass now. Why does he find it difficult to get grass? As journalists, we ask. Because the climate is changing. The grass production has decreased. Maybe somebody is grazing more over there. So in journalism, and now for all of you growing up, we'd really like you to start asking more and more questions and challenging the information that you get. Even if the information is that, rural India is like this and urban India is like that, even that needs to be challenged, right? Okay, we'll show you the last story, Profiles of Migrants. So here's a project by class 11 students. Come down to the map, please. So here's a project by grade 11 students done across the country. Different schools have done it for us in India. Different students have done it. It's a very, very interesting project. It was just before the lockdown, actually. So migrants are people who move from their original homes. There could be different kinds of migrants. Sometimes migrants are just for a season. Sometimes migrants are for a few days, for a harvest, for a crop, and so on. But there are the longer term migrants, people who move from rural India to work in urban India, right? The reason being, as you may have guessed, is because their lives are no longer sustainable. Maybe agriculture has failed, maybe they have a loan to be repaid because agriculture failed, maybe somebody fell sick in the family and they needed to repay that loan. So they've come looking for jobs as your dhobi, your cook, your ayah, your driver, your watchman. These are all migrants from rural India. Am I right? Everyone here? Yeah, you agree with me, right? It's true in Bangalore, I'm sure it's true in Chennai. So who are these people? So students went out and spoke to them. They spoke to them and they asked them, like, what made you move? What made you leave your home and family and come away for 11 months at a time? You just get, you earn just barely enough to go back once a year. Somebody had moved because, he just needed that extra 2,000 rupees a month. So he moved thousands of kilometers from his home to work. So there's a map. And this set of stories, there are many stories, but this set has 5 stories in it by students. It shows you that all the way from Assam, a young girl called Pulina Tikre, whose parents died in a road accident, came to the south, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, worked in 3 different factories, a noodle making factory, a khakra factory, a factory packaging, atta and rice and so on, just so that she could send money home for her sister to study. Pulina herself was only 17 years old. But she did it because she wanted her sister to study. And she says, all I want now is to go back and continue my studies. Right? And who was Pulina? Pulina was a young girl working in the house of this student. And this girl didn't know the story about her until she asked the questions, and then she asked the reasons behind it. And then she understood the journey of migration. Right? Like that, there are many stories. The story from UP on top, from Belghat, Uttar Pradesh, is a chap who's a painter. And he's doing he's in the construction labor in somebody's house. And he's doing the painting. And he says, I really miss my family. I'm not seeing my children grow up, but I'm doing this because I want them to have an education, which I never had. And then he ends the story by saying, if you had the family broke apart, she had to end up doing jharu pocha, sweeping, swabbing in someone's house. She saw a Kannada textbook lying there, and she started looking at it. And the person came and said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I can read. I'm a class 10 pass." And then cut to 2 years later, and she's taking Kannada tuitions. Yeah, she's moved from being, just sweeping, swabbing to also teaching students like you who maybe need a third language help, right? So these are really lovely stories done by young people just like you. So that's the People's Archive of Rural India. This is what we do. And yeah, if you have any questions for us.
Let's take them through faces.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have one project that we thought you'd really...
One last project that essentially ties all the work we try to do together. It's an ambitious project, but it's also a very simple project. There's a bit of a backstory to it. In 2014, a 20-year-old boy by the name of Nido Tanya was in Delhi, and he was going to a particular place. He lost his way. This is perhaps before everyone had access to Google Maps. So he stopped at a crowded marketplace in Delhi called Lajpat Nagar, for those of you who've ever been and are familiar, and he asked for directions. He asked for directions at a milk booth, and we don't know what exactly transpired, but that interaction led to a big fight. He was beaten. The cops got involved. He's 19, mind you. And he was taken to the police station. He complained of not feeling well. In the evening, he was moved to a hospital. The next day, he succumbed to his injuries, and he passed away. He's a 19-year-old boy. Now, when reporters went to the scene of the crime and were trying to understand how the hell this happened, they found out that some of the onlookers said, there was, his hair looked funny, he had these blonde streaks, and a casual comment that passed through was, "Wo chinkita." Nido is a boy from Arunachal Pradesh. It's one of the 7 states that make up the northeast of India, right? And in the mainland, because of our ignorance, we use terms like chinky, bahadur, etc., that are very derogatory. These are people who are very much a part of India, whose culture is as old as the rest of this country's. Now, the reason why the story became a big deal was because Nido's dad was an MLA. So everybody got on board. Rahul Gandhi tweeted about it, Narendra Modi tweeted about it. It became a national story, but it wasn't an isolated event. In fact, up until that point, and even after, there are plenty of racist attacks met out against people from the northeast of this country because many people believe they're not a part of India, right? They don't eat the food we eat, they look differently, they behave differently. Now, how do you tackle a problem of such rampant ignorance? Sure, you can have a really long editorial in the news when an incident like this occurs, but that'll be forgotten. Public memory is very short-lived. So, the journalist who started Pari, Mr. P. Sainath, a very established, formidable journalist in India, said there is one thing we can do. Let's take photographs of people, right? From every block in every district of this country. And when you do that, what's going to happen is you'll see that if you start taking photographs in Chennai, move to Erode, move to Nagarkoil, move to other districts, people will largely resemble one another. But you traverse the length and breadth of this country and you'll see people look wildly different from one another. How people look in the north is very different from the south, the east, the west, and the central parts of India. India is basically a world within a country. And through the simple art of photography, by asking people their names, their occupations, their dreams, their hopes, you get a facial map of how diverse India actually is. And through that exercise, even if you can't read, you'll see that an Indian who has, features that are Oriental, are very much a part of the mainland as much as you and I are. So Faces is essentially, in a nutshell, what Pari is trying to do at large, bring in diversity to the Indian media, have representation, use the art of photography, videography to tell stories better. And even if you all don't end up writing big stories for Pari education, you should consider Faces as a project that you could do.
So when I was in college in Delhi 30 years ago, a term that was often used for people who came from the south was Madrasi, right? You came from any of the 4 South Indian states, you were going to be labeled a Madrasi. I hope that has changed now, I don't know. But that's exactly the kind of stereotype that exists. It may not be a prejudice, it just may be a stereotype, but that's something that we really want to break at, let me see now, about 4,000 meters high. We were in this meadow. Those are the sheep behind him, you can't really see that. And he has actually traveled from another district in Jammu and Kashmir, in Jammu actually, to come and do this herding work. Now, it's very fascinating. Herding is something that, people don't talk about as work because we don't really interact with herders. They're here today. The animals have moved on. They've also moved on. So we don't really have much knowledge. In Pari, we have a very large selection of stories about pastoralists and herders. Camel, buffalo, cow, sheep, goat, yak, and so on, right? So we urge you to check out Pari and, check those stories. Anyway, Abdul Rashid is a shepherd from Bakarwal. He's 20 years old. He dropped out of school sometime before lockdown. And he said, I said, so what do you like about what you do? And he said, I just like the open air. I love being in the open. I love the clean air. I love this life that I have. And I'm happy doing what I do. So there again, this idea that, his life must be really hard, it's cold, it's wet. It is. Of course it's cold. Of course it's wet on many days. Yes, he does live under a tarpaulin sheep when his animals are grazing in a particular area. There are no cement huts for them, right? But he loves what he does. Yeah? And you can see it from the smile on his face. Yep, we've got some more faces here. Here, this is a shepherd who, parts of Kashmir valleys are given to families which keep them for generations. So although Mohammad Rajab Chopan lives down in the valley, he is allowed to graze his sheep for what looked to me like many, many acres of land in this meadow. And he's got about 1,000 sheep, which not just him, but he and his brothers look after. That's their job. So they have a rough kind of a stone hut. And he says, we lost 90 animals in a sudden snowstorm in June. In 50 years, I can't remember if it ever snowed in this month. We didn't get any compensation for it. So the government does give compensation for, loss of animals to tigers and so on. But he says we didn't get any compensation. But the story behind that is also about climate change. And how climate change is impacting somebody who lives up there in the Himalayas. I mean, it's a serious impact, losing 90 animals, right? Here's someone else. She said, well, that's his niece, actually. These are horsemen. Ghulam Rasul Chopan was a horseman. Okay. This is a little girl I met while trekking down, actually. She was going to spend a few days with her. Her father was taking her to spend he's a shepherd. And she says, I'm happy with my father in the mountains. That's something any one of us would say, right? I mean, that's if you like the mountains. Yeah, okay. So now we're open for questions. We're open for comments, anything. The field is yours. The floor is yours, sorry. Somebody has a question.
Meera.
How would you want them to start? What kind of,
Okay, so first of all, do you guys want to contribute to Pari? Yeah? Oh, great. Okay, that's great to hear. So, we showed you a couple of stories done by students, right? Raman's story about his mother, the Jururi Heart story. We showed you a story run by 4 students together, by an individual student. There are many. If we can show you on the Pari education side, just drop down. We've covered agriculture, COVID-19, migrants. There are many, many different kinds of stories. So, you have to tell us. Let's say that the students of KC High class 9 and 10 want to do a series about the recent floods and how it impacted people who live near the river or near the sea or whatever. I don't know, wherever the floods came. Or let's say you want to do a set of stories about migrants. You want to add to the migrant stories that we have. We are on profiles of migrants number 7. You could be number 8, in which we have stories of migrants into Chennai, who, as I said, are your watchman, your driver, your cook, the construction laborer in the house next door which is being built, any of these people. And if you actually talk to them, and if we'll give you a set of questions, we'll design a question set for you, we'll give you tips about how to take good photographs and how to ask questions. But the most important thing here is that you have to have the time for a conversation. This is not a survey. This is not a question answer. Journalism is done through conversations, right?
I have a question. So, say for example, we go to Karnataka. I don't know Kannada, so how would I talk to the locals?
You need an interpreter, you need a translator.
So will Pari help me with that, or do I have to like find one on my own?
You'll have to find one because I don't know where you're going. I can maybe, if you're going to the Nilgiris, I can point out one or two people where you could get a translator, since I've used. But your location may be very different, your circumstances may be very different. You might find somebody very easily actually,
Okay.
who's happy to translate. But let me tell you, translation is a very slippery slope. Very often what we do is, because we only understand and write in English and think in English and maybe we know one other language, we tend to over-sophisticate what people say in their own language. We use phrases which they don't use in their language when we are talking in our language, in English, right? So, translation should be done carefully. You should pause the translator every 2 sentences and say, no, I'm writing down what you said, because at Pari we're very particular about the voices of people. It's not my voice, it's not Vishaka's voice, it's not Sanviti's voice. It is the voices of the people in the story. And if we don't get the translation right, we'll make a mistake there. Yeah?
Okay. Any other questions here? Does anyone have a question?
Okay, anyone has a story idea that now you've heard all these stories, you think that may be a story idea, would you like to throw it up and let's hear it? Yes.
Seeing this, I was thinking of going back to my...
Where you have some family connection. Yes, that's a great idea. You can speak to people who work on the farm. Maybe you can find out if cropping patterns have changed, if what they grow has changed, what has led to that change. Remember, always ask about the processes, right? Don't speak to rich farmers. Their stories are enough in the media, right?
A majority of my dad's side of the family they work in a village. They have farms. I don't think it's a really big one, but I've heard a bunch of stories about my grandmother going from Chennai to go live there and like helping out there. She was married at the age of 16, and so she had to help out for like the majority of her life and her experiences and stuff. So I've asked her about it, and I'm planning to do something about it as well.
I mean, you could speak to the workers on the farm and your grandmother, make the story.
No, there are no workers. Like my...
Just her?
No, not her. As in like my dad's side of the family, right? My dad's cousins and siblings and stuff like that, they work there. They don't have any workers. So, yeah.
You could definitely pitch such a story to us and we'll help you. And as Vishaka rightly said, things like caste, things like gender labor, the labor of different people, right? How much money they earn, what is the set rate over there, what is the yield, what is the harvest. These are all journalistic details that you will need to bring in. Yeah, would you pass?
I have a question. Let's say I'm going somewhere inside of India to do an interview. How specific do I need to get the information? Like, how do I know I have enough information to write an article?
So, what is your name? Rohit. So Rohit's question is, how specific do I need to be? How much information do I need to get for it to become a story? I'll answer that question in 2 parts. One, we'll help you with what we call the reporter's cheat sheet, right? So we've got about 10 questions that we think are necessary in stories about migrants, in stories about understanding livelihoods. So if you have that, that can be like your spine. You can keep going back to those questions. But it also depends on what you want this story to be about. Is it about this person's, labor? Is it about this person's children? And like Preeti said, approach it like a conversation with as much curiosity as you have. You're likely to get the best out of them as well, and you'll see that you have quite a bit of information, right? Or is it the monkey story?
Yeah, my name is Kannan. I am teach business for grade 9. The purpose of asking these questions is to understand what you are going to say and take it back into my classroom and bring out my own context based on what I read. So I come from that angle. The first question is, what is the are you all bringing about some transformation, or is your role to bring about some transformation? If that is the case, can you all tell us your story? What is your story? I have one more question after this. Yeah.
Yeah.
My second question is, you're reaching out to the children today. Have you all reached out to the corporate world?
So, Mr. Khanna, interestingly, Vishaka and I were originally business journalists. We started our careers as business journalists, and we have moved to rural reporting. I think the role of journalism, whether it leads to change, is something we hope for. But I would say, and Vishaka, please add, it's really about bringing awareness, because without awareness, change cannot happen. So, for example, we told you the story about the leprosy and Aadhaar, right? There are many stories like that on Pari which have led to some change in policy, have led to some change in the government's way of thinking, and maybe has made corporates pull back from something they were doing which they were not able to see, or not, the voices of people impacted by it was not heard, right? So I would say more than finding a solution, it's about raising awareness. Vishaka, you?
Yeah. So we don't partner with NGOs. You know, we're not doing work on the ground. We're not building toilets or schools or things like that. We simply don't have the budget, and our skill set is relegated to journalism, awareness building. That being said, we try to publicize these stories as much as possible. And over the last 7 years, we've built up a pretty good following of largely urban readers, because they're the ones with digital access. Now, when they see these stories, and many of these stories are also reported by children, people are very moved. So they write to us saying, how can we help these people? Can we, pay a certain amount of money? Can we sponsor their kids? Can we buy them a vehicle? You know, people who we've reported on have actually gone to the extent of being able to build a small house for themselves, because the public that's read their stories have been so touched. So there is no formal process where you can go on to Pari and you can help the people we report about. But there is an indirect channel where we give people bank account details. We're just an intermediary. We don't facilitate through our accounts. We connect you to the people who need help, and they get help. So yeah, like Preeti said, we got into this solely to transform public awareness. You know, we're trying to do that as slowly as possible. God knows you require a lot of money too. And to answer your second question, have we approached corporates? We don't take money from corporations, because...
corporates to join us, is it?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What did you say?
I did not mean approaching corporates from the viewpoint of taking money from them. Corporates can play a great role in your transformational process. I'll explain how. Today, branding by corporates works on principles of ethical sourcing, organic farming, getting organic products to consumers. Can you all usher in some kind of a transformation in corporate thinking, that they go and they depend on rural markets to a great extent? 60% of corporate profits comes from rural India, incidentally. Now, can they can they go to the grassroots and start sourcing products, transforming them into brands and bringing them back into India?
Right. Can you
through such approaches? I mean, it can be you can know the transformation could be much, much faster. I'm looking at possibilities.
Right.
You raise a fair point, and like I said, we are journalists. We are limited in our approach to business and transformation and all of these things. We're open to ideas. I think maybe, we've burnt our fingers, or at least in the past, other journalists have tried to do things like this. And at the end of the day, the corporate sector is a profit-seeking sector, so they will think about themselves first before you can actually think about the welfare of other people, right? And I think that is like a diktat that even permeates to taking money from the corporates to say, perhaps help people we write about, or in the kind of coverage we do. So I'm not saying that we're absolutely averse to it. In the past, we have tried, it hasn't worked too well. But if we have, viable options, yeah, I mean.
Yeah. So we are a little careful about CSR.
You'd be also surprised how nobody really wants to fund journalism.
So
are you building a school?
You're building a toilet, you're supplying medical equipment and a PHC, everyone's very happy to fund you. But this is the thing, is to make people aware that journalism has a role, and what is the role of journalism. And like what you said about branding earlier, for example, I did a story in the Nilgiris on Toda embroidery, which has a GI, it has a geographical indicator. Nobody outside of the Nilgiris, outside of the Toda community can produce it. But we found to our horror that big online clothing giants were selling embroidered clothes saying this is Toda embroidery. Now that is illegal. It's also incorrect because much of that embroidery was not hand, it was machine, and some of it was just a print of an embroidery, right? Yeah. So we, when we did this story, we raised awareness about it. We showed you can just go to the pictures. We showed even, where it, there's a pic, there, yeah. So we showed, there is a GI certificate on the left. There is a GO selling it, inaccurate and illegal, and so on. So the Tamil Nadu government and one NGO in the Nilgiris has taken up this case, and it has been created into a case against these big corporates, right? Because as you rightly said, the branding, they're trying very hard to keep their branding. But because they don't get a voice, this story actually, if I had not chanced upon it, Vishaka and I were reporting in the Nilgiris, and this lady just said to me, you should do something about this. Look what is happening. And then she showed me on her phone this picture, and we said, okay, fine, we are going to do this story. Yeah, any comments, questions?
Yeah.
I think we need to end right now, right? It's lunchtime for you?
I wanted to do something. So for the past 4 years, we've had house help from this lady, and she's really, really nice. So her husband recently passed away. He wasn't exactly a great husband, but she has 3 kids who are all girls. So because of that, she was shunned out from her family. And because her husband passed away, a lot of the work that she was getting, the people weren't willing to give her work anymore because she's unmarried, doesn't have a husband, a widow. So a lot of the people would call her filthy because she doesn't have a husband anymore. So a lot of the work that she had previously to support 3 daughters was gone. So, and even people in my community weren't willing to see her or look at her because she was unmarried. And these are people that are from our, so exactly. So it's from our society. So we wouldn't expect it. So yeah, and my parents were just so confused why. Yeah.
Yeah, it's already sounds like a great story. You should do it. Yeah.
Right next to my apartment, they're building a new apartment, and there's a little gap, and there's a small slum area. So basically, everybody who's working there is working in the the builders. Yeah. So they're all working there. There are lots of small children there, and the thing is, they're not. It's not their permanent home. They keep moving wherever they have wherever the work is. So I just wanted to know more about that because how their life is and how they because a lot of those children don't go to school. So how do they get if they get education at all, which I don't know.
So it's wonderful that you're even thinking of these questions. So clearly you're already thinking of these things. Now you need to take the next step and actually have that conversation and figure out what the truth is, right? So we have a series on construction workers, and exactly the same problem many students have found, that where are they? I'm going to school, my parents have a permanent home here, but where are these children going to go? Because 3 months later they'll be somewhere else, right? And then what is the processes behind it? Can they join a government school for 3 months and then move to another location and join that government school? No. Even there's going to be a problem, right? People have to join at a particular time of the year. So yes, these are great stories. If you all want to do a series in class 9 and 10, some of you want to do a series of stories on construction workers, migrant laborers who live and work around you and who belong to a socio-economic class which is not reported in the media, right? So, because of course there are migrants into Chennai who are in a very, posh homes and who have a much different socio-economic class. We're not talking about those migrants. Right? Their stories have been told more than enough.
Would any of the grade 10 students want to talk about your visit to the fishing village in Kovalam and how you went about interviewing people there and your experience? Any volunteers? Grade 10, come on. Volunteers. Should I pick a victim?
So yeah, we did. I think we were split up into groups, and we went to the houses of families at the fishing village to interview them. But obviously, we didn't make it look like an interview. We were genuinely interested to converse with them, and I think we learned a lot about their lifestyle. We got to know them, and how they work. The family we interviewed, the father went to university, and they have children. So we really learned a lot about their community, and it was definitely very eye-opening for us when we visited them.
Do a Pari story on it? Yeah? Okay. So if you have to do a Pari story, Meera, this is clearly something that would be of interest since you all have been there. We would like to know details. So there is a how to write for Pari. There is a checklist. You can go to the Pari education one.
They have gone through the checklist.
Yeah, you've gone through the checklist, so you know what we are looking for. And what is the purpose of doing this story is a conversation you need to ask yourself, like why am I doing this story, what do I want to do. So then what is it that I want to amplify. I want to amplify the voices of fishermen and fisherwomen who otherwise don't get heard. It doesn't have to be a sad and pathetic story. Like we've shown you many stories which are not necessarily in that category, right? Okay.
I had like an idea, because me and my family, we would go to a temple. It would usually be a yearly visit, or like 6 months, and it would only it would be located in a village roughly around maybe 20-15 houses. It's a very small community, and I'm going there since I was 6 years old. Now I'm 15. The only source of income that I've noticed that the people there can how they make money is by farm animals. Those are the only, by farming animals like chickens, cows, the milk from the cows and the eggs from the chickens, things like that. That was the only source of income for all those people. And there were only, I think, 2 breeders in the entire village. So out of 2 breeders, the entire village would usually have to find money to buy them. So I felt like without all those things, it was, yeah.
There's wonderful stories about animals that we have. We haven't shared some, but that's a great story about breeding, about which kinds of animals are bred, how much they cost, how do people buy them, what are their returns. If you're students of economics or business, what are their returns, what are their investments in that animal, how much do they make out of it, what is the lean season, what are the expenses that are increasing or decreasing, how things have changed, right? That's a great story. What's your name? Arnav. And you are? Anushka. Okay. So we look forward to your stories, Arnav and Anushka, and yours as well. Sorry. So you've heard all these buzzwords today. You've heard Kuno, cheetah, leopard, lion, wilderness library, Haryana, and so on. If you want to know more, there's some lovely videos in the Kuno and cheetah story. Do go home and have a look at it. You'll get to see the videos as well. Check out the Pari education site. If you look for construction stories, migrant stories, you'll find lots of stuff there. Please do read the Pari website and share these stories with your friends and family. Remember, the idea is to amplify it, right? Thanks very much. We want to just take a few vox pops from some of you after the session. So if maybe a few of you could just stay back.